Welcome back to Bazooka Kickboxing and MMA. Today's episode, powered by Hayabusa, is all about unorthodox boxing. It may look technically wrong, but you can get a lot of success if you land them correctly. Today's episode, we're going to talk a lot about unorthodox boxing. Whenever you learn a technique, you learn the traditional classic way of throwing it, which is really important because you need to develop strong basics when it comes to martial arts. So whenever you learn to punch or kick, you have your textbook way of throwing things. Hands up nice and high, one hand I say always on the phone, and then learning extension and returning back to the same spot, which is right, and you do need that a majority of the times in your fight. But being able to mix up your guard a little bit can confuse your opponent as well as land unorthodox angles. If you're continually punching from that traditional way I'm talking about, it's easy for your opponent to block. And you want to confuse your opponents at times. So sometimes I might bring my lead hand down, take advantage of that Philly shell, but at this point, I might not have a nice jab from up top, but this hand being down is really nice for me to go up. And that's the first one I'm going to talk about, the low lead hand. And you see this one a lot in boxing because, again, you want to hit that angle that your opponent can't see. If everything's at eye level, this is the perfect opportunity to drop that lead hand and be able to mix the shot going up. So that low lead hand really mixes up your opponent, and it's called a low line jab because it's coming from a low line and it's underneath your opponent's vision. So it's very hard for them to defend. So I like to use this one a lot by getting the hands up, and then I'll mix my lead hand down and then try to hit that shot from up. Now, it's important to talk about by lead hand being down, it does expose my head. So this is where a lot of people might say, you know what, it's not the best shot because you're gonna get hit, you're gonna get countered. But as long as you're not getting hit with the shot and you're able to move and evade and understand what your opponent's throwing, I wouldn't necessarily call it wrong. It's just different, and we've seen a lot of successful boxers use this Philly shell really well. So as long as your head's moving and you're able to move, evade shots with your footwork or your head movement, it's not wrong. So the first one, try to mix up that low line jab, especially from a nice high guard. I find it works really, really well. The second unorthodox boxing strike I'm going to talk about is using backhands. Especially if you want to talk about the first with the low hand, you can even paw yourself up and using this backhand to mix in nice rear straights, or even with my rear hand, if my opponent's guard is up nice and high, I might throw an unorthodox backhand to the inside of my opponent's guard to try to open up their hand. So pump through here, and then I mix in that lead hand shot. So using these backhands are really nice to be able to mix up rhythm and timing. Especially with my lead hand back fist, one, I can keep my opponent away, pawing away, but it also sets up a nice off timing two down the middle. So paw, paw, boom, boom, and you can really mix that rear straight down with that off tempo. Really mixes things up really well. So the backhand is always nice to use because it's a big target and it blinds your opponent. If I'm mixing in this strike here, it's very hard to see what's coming out. And again, old school martial arts training, the back fist was a very important tool and a weapon. So we've seen it a lot with people use it as spinning back fists, but you can use a nice back fist from nice short range to be able to pop and be able to create different offense and different angles. Now let's get into the third unorthodox style of boxing you might see, and that's with a very high guard, right? You'll see someone like the Diaz brothers, a Mike Perry in more modern MMA, really use high hands. And what their concept is being able to punch down on your opponent. If your hands are always down here, right, you know that angle's here and your opponent's gonna wanna come on top. And that's where the dangerous shot happens. So by having a high guard, you might expose your body a little bit to your opponent, but that's okay because as they go down to kind of dig and rip body shots, you just come down on top. And technically and biomechanically, it doesn't look like you can generate a lot of power because you're not using the ground, the rotation in my hip, the torque in my core, right? And the snapping of the punch. They're just coming down. But if you think about MMA, that small glove is enough to create that damage. So basically what you're seeing is them snapping, coming down, and this way, it's really hard for your opponent to block. So now when you start mixing up these different traditional guard, low line, high guard coming down, you always keep your opponent guessing. And this is where these types of strikes are really important, okay? Confuse your opponent. Even if for that split second, I might be keeping my hands low, then I might come up high for a second. It just confuses my opponent to be able to land these shots more effectively and more successfully. The fourth unorthodox shot I'm gonna talk about is actually going to rip the body. Now, when you start ripping the body with your traditional hooks and shovel punches, a lot of times you have, your palm facing up or the palm facing you, which again, good power, and that's how we're used to throwing our hooks. But now when you rip the body sometimes, it's nice to be able to turn your hand around. So you're still hitting with the two knuckles, but it's coming right around the guard. And when people block body shots, you can see the elbows usually come to the body, which leaves a little bit of a gap right behind their tricep. So this is where this shot is really nice to land. It just comes around and you can see the angle of the forearm and the angle of the tricep and the way the hand lands, it just fits perfectly. So using this nice looping round, almost like a back fist to the body, you're gonna find opens up that body shot really, really well. And you can do them on both sides, mixing one, mixing two. And the beautiful thing about that, it gets your opponents to really open up their elbows. Because the shot's becoming really round, your opponent or your training partner has to open up the elbows, which then opens up the middle for you to get that uppercut. So nice looping round, especially mixed with shovel punches, because you're making your opponent guess. Are you coming in or are you getting out? Just opens the body, opens the head for uppercuts and hooks as well. So mix in that rear punch, back fist to the body. The fifth and final unorthodox style of boxing we're gonna talk about is palm strikes, okay? So you can use it as a strike or you can use it almost as a slap. And you can use them in different ways. And the best way that I like to use this shot is when I have my opponent shelled. When I'm striking and I see my opponent really cover their head to defend their head, this is where I start using these pawing shots that I like to mix. So either I use it as a big pawing slap to get my opponent to really cover their head, this way I can rip the body, or I might use it as a hand pin or a frame to be able to frame, slightly move, create an angle to mix up the shots, right? Well, especially when I'm head to head, I don't want to stay with my head and forearms matched to my opponent. I want to start creating angles. And using these pawing palm strikes, you could really do some good damage, either as a hand pin or a hand frame. And if your opponent doesn't want to put their hands up, boom, the nice pawing strike can do a lot of damage, especially if you hit in the ear. Coming from a traditional martial arts, Taekwondo, when I was really young, self-defense was a really big part of the training in the curriculum. And a lot of the damaging strikes you learn in self-defense is open hand palm strikes. If you can strike your opponent's ear, pop the eardrum, it just that's a nice strike that does a lot of damage, that doesn't take a lot of force and energy and power. Okay, so be able to mix in these pawing strikes. Sometimes you'll even notice I use them to the body. I'll go head to the body, even just tap the body, then to rip up the hand. All I have to do is close my hand when I'm ready to create it. And you'll even notice in MMA, a lot of times with the small gloves, if someone's shelled up against the cage, you'll see even people using these inside hammer fists to be able to create some offensive as well. If my opponent's hand's here, I have a little gap here where I could even mix in some good hammer fists down the middle, right? You might not learn this in your traditional boxing, but there is little areas, little angles, and little holes that you could really exploit to get the power and the damage there, okay? So, to summarize this video for you, yes, it's really important to understand that you do need a basic, solid style of fighting. Good footwork, good rotation, good power, and good hand position. Just as you want good defense, you want to be able to attack and bring your hands back in a good, solid, powerful way. But there's times as you get more advanced, you're going to have to be a little bit more creative with your striking. You're going to have to create off angles, different tempos, different rhythms, and different angles, even with the punches as well as your footwork. So use these 5 different variations, and they might just come out naturally. And a lot of times you're going to see me when I do my bag work, I work on hitting my hands on different angles because I like to use different angles when I fight, and I want to make sure my hand is tough enough to be able to land those shots, okay? So learn the basics as strong as you can, but mix in these little variations in unorthodox boxing, and you're going to see sometimes those are the ones that will get you your knockout because your opponent's not used to them. You have to have a little bit of feinting, a little bit of trickery into your style sometimes, especially if you're fighting someone very good with their basics and very experienced. So if you're liking these videos, make sure you keep liking and subscribing. Hit the notification bell to keep up to date. And make sure you follow along with HayabusaFight.com. All of this gear is sponsored by Hayabusa, as it's one of my favorite. Their T3 boxing gloves offers that nice knuckle and wrist protection to let me really throw my punches and strikes with all the power that I can. Okay? Make sure you get over to their site, HayabusaFight.com, and we'll see you next week here at Bazooka Kickboxing and MMA.